Excellencies, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I hereby declare open the 10th meeting of the 46th session of the Human Rights Council. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now continue the interactive dialogue on the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, submitted pursuant to Council Resolution 40/1, entitled Promoting Reconciliation, Accountability and Human Rights in Sri Lanka. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President. The United Kingdom welcomes the High Commissioner's detailed and most comprehensive report on Sri Lanka. We share the concerns regarding the reversal of progress on issues of accountability and also the current human rights situation and the risk and recurrence of past violations. We are also concerned at the increase in surveillance and indeed harassment of civil society actors, the militarization of the civilian governmental functions, and the impact of the government's forced cremation policy on different communities in Sri Lanka, particularly the Muslim community, who continue to face persecution. We also regret the government of Sri Lanka's decision to withdraw support for Resolution 30/1 and note the previous domestic initiatives have all failed, regrettably, to deliver meaningful accountability. The appointment of senior military officials allegedly implicated in war crimes and crimes against humanity also calls into question Sri Lanka's commitment to accountability and justice. Therefore, the Human Rights Council must continue to consider the situation in Sri Lanka and press for progress on justice, reconciliation, and accountability.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
Madam President, the EU thanks the High Commissioner for her report, which we welcome. We reaffirm our commitment to human rights, reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka. We regret that Sri Lanka no longer supports the comprehensive HRC process. We are concerned about a setback of the important gains. It is key to preserve the Office of Missing Persons and the Office for Reparation as independent and sufficiently resourced. We share the High Commissioner's concern about warning signs of a deteriorating human rights situation, including erosion of democratic checks and balances, rise of exclusionary rhetoric, surveillance and intimidation of CSOs and others, as well as discrimination of persons belonging to religious and ethnic minority communities. We are concerned about ongoing impunity for past gross violations. Though the HRC has for many years stressed the need for accountability, domestic processes did not deliver. We attach great importance to the High Commissioner's assessments of avenues for advancing accountability and ending impunity. We hope that the government will remain committed to reconciliation and accountability and continue to ensure the effective functioning of the National Human Rights Commission and cooperate with OHCHR and special procedures. Madam High Commissioner, how to involve and protect victims in ensuring accountability? Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Norway on behalf of Nordic countries for a video statement.
President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the Nordic countries. We welcome the report of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on Sri Lanka and share the concerns raised. Since 2015, Sri Lanka have taken important steps in strengthening democratic institutions, but recent negative developments threaten to undermine gains achieved. Progress in transitional justice, accountability and reconciliation is lacking and has in some cases been reversed. The country's minorities are increasingly marginalized. Sustainable development will only be achieved on the basis of human rights and through an inclusive process, where impunity for past gross violations of international human rights and humanitarian law is addressed, including through effective and independent institutions. Of particular concern is the shrinking space for civil society. We urge Sri Lanka to review the Prevention of Terrorism Act to ensure its compliance with Sri Lanka's international human rights and humanitarian law obligations, and to end all forms of surveillance and harassment of human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers and victims. We also encourage Sri Lankan authorities to end the practice of forced cremation or COVID-19 fatalities. We urge Sri Lanka to fully engage with the High Commissioner for Human Rights and Special Procedures and to implement the recommendations of the OHCHR report. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Canada for a video statement.
Canada welcomes the High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka. We regret Sri Lanka's decision to withdraw its support of Resolution 30/1. Domestic processes for reconciliation and accountability have repeatedly failed to deliver results. The survivors have been persistent in their efforts to seek the truth and have taken extraordinary risks to offer evidence. We recognize their resilience and their courage. We share in the High Commissioner's concerns regarding the deterioration of human rights, which regrettably may lead to a recurrence of violence and conflict if left unaddressed. Civilian government, an independent judiciary, civil society space, respect for human rights, democracy and the rule of law are all being undermined. Forced cremation of Muslims, restrictions on Tamil memorials will further fuel divisions on the island. Canada believes the Council has a responsibility to keep Sri Lanka on its agenda and to continue its efforts to promote reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. We encourage Sri Lanka to engage constructively with the OHCHR and to honor its standing invitation to special procedures. Madam High Commissioner, how can states most effectively support the OHCHR to continue to gather and preserve evidence?
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Germany for a video statement.
Madam President, Germany aligns itself with the EU statement. As part of the core group on Sri Lanka, Germany reiterates the importance of the Human Rights Council efforts in advancing human rights, reconciliation and accountability in Sri Lanka. Germany acknowledges positive steps taken by Sri Lanka, but is worried that several developments in the past year counter the Human Rights Council efforts. We are concerned about the implications of the recent constitutional amendment for the independence and effective functioning of the National Human Rights Commission, the Office of Missing Persons, and the Office for Reparations. We are also concerned about shrinking civic space and that those who pursued accountability in recent years fear reprisals now. Germany is convinced that a comprehensive dealing with the past is necessary for inclusive and sustainable reconciliation and that crimes of the past cannot remain unpunished. The High Commissioner in her report mentioned that investigations can also be pursued under universal jurisdiction. This is happening in Germany already, where the Office of the Federal Prosecutor has filed a case against a former LTTE member. Madam High Commissioner, how can your office support relevant judicial proceedings? Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Russian Federation.
Госпожа Верховный комиссар.
Madam High Commissioner, we have carefully examined the report on the Sri Lanka situation and welcome that country's efforts to improve the human rights situation. We note Sri Lanka's openness to dialogue on human rights and the country's readiness to continue discussing existing problems and ways to resolve them, including through international technical assistance. We also feel it is important to note that within this work, Sri Lanka must itself, without external pressure, determine the priorities for action and the areas which require international assistance. Only in that way can the measures truly be effective and facilitate a real strengthening of the promotion and protection of human rights in the country. We confirm our position on the fact that existing issues with human rights in countries can only be resolved with the interested countries through open, constructive dialogue and cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to France. France, you have.
Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui. Can you hear me?
Yes, please proceed.
Parfait. Merci, Madame la...
Thank you, Madam President. Madam High Commissioner, France would like to thank you for your recent report on the situation of human rights and the uncertainties surrounding the national reconciliation process carried out in Sri Lanka. The situation requires our vigilance. Although the human rights situation has improved since the end of the war, lasting progress needs to be obtained. This requires support from the new authorities. Since 2009, France has always supported the work of the Human Rights Council, particularly Resolution 31, aiming to promote reconciliation and accountability in promoting human rights. Adopted in 2015, we regret the fact that the current government has withdrawn its co-sponsorship in January 2020 because it believed this was against its domestic legislation. In this context, France encourages the government to pursue its cooperation with the Human Rights Council to strengthen reconciliation process and also consolidate the progress achieved. France takes note of the government's desire to ensure socio-economic development and security, which all Sri Lankans aspire to. And we'd also recall that lasting development is inextricably linked to achieving human rights. Madam High Commissioner, how do you envisage to continue the work of the Human Rights Council regarding Sri Lanka, should the government decide to break off dialogue with the Human Rights Council? Many thanks.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to North Macedonia for a video statement.
Madam President, we thank the High Commissioner for the comprehensive report on Sri Lanka. North Macedonia, as a member of the core group, remains committed to promoting reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. We encourage Sri Lanka to engage in good faith with the Office of High Commissioner and the Council. The overall goal of 30/1 must be protected and built upon to provide justice and redress to victims. 30/1 envisaged 4 crucial transitional justice mechanisms. 2 of them, the Office on Missing Persons and on Repatriations, have achieved valuable progress. It should not be undermined. The remaining 2, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the special judicial mechanisms, are yet to be established. Accountability is key. Sri Lanka needs to take urgent steps to ensure criminal accountability domestically. Additionally, we support the Office of High Commissioner to help preserve information and evidence for future accountability processes. Madam High Commissioner, your report sets the alarm for possible recurrence of grave human rights violation. The Council should recognize your call for early warning action and adopt the proposed resolution by consensus. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Australia.
Australia, you can begin now.
Thank you, Madam President. Australia thanks the High Commissioner for her comprehensive report. We note Sri Lanka's stated commitment to continue measures of peace building, reparation and development. We acknowledge progress made by the Office of Missing Persons and the Office of Reparations and encourage the ongoing and independent operations of these and other key institutions. We recognise the High Commissioner's concerns regarding the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, including the need for accountability measures that acknowledge past and ongoing grievances, protection of the right to freedom of religion or belief, including in responses to COVID-19, such as forced cremations, and an environment in which civil society, including human rights defenders and journalists, can play their vital roles. We encourage Sri Lanka to ensure its legal framework, including counter-terrorism legislation, is in line with international standards. Noting the importance of a preventative approach, we support the report's recommendations that Sri Lanka continue to work with UN human rights mechanisms. This includes the facilitation of technical assistance in implementing the recommendations of such mechanisms and working with the Council-mandated process on promoting reconciliation, accountability and human rights. Australia has been a long-standing partner in Sri Lanka's reconciliation efforts. We are committed to supporting Sri Lanka through constructive and practical engagement to implement its transitional justice commitments and international human rights obligations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Philippines for video statement.
Thank you, Chair. The Philippines considers the credibility of UHRC reports to be critical to the integrity of the work of the Council and has consistently called for objectivity and fairness in the reporting process. We are concerned that this report fails to ground itself properly on contextual realities, particularly the challenges of addressing the grave threats of the pandemic and terrorism to Sri Lanka's 21.3 million people. For a country like the Philippines, which has lost precious lives to terrorism, the report's mischaracterization of security policies in Sri Lanka is insensitive to the long struggle of its people against conflict and terrorism. We regret that this feeds the troubling discourse in the Council that downplays the victims of terrorism and earnest efforts by affected countries to stop it within the framework of law. We note that despite challenges, the government of Sri Lanka actively pursues reconciliation, accountability, and human rights through domestic processes with all stakeholders.
The High Commissioner for her in-depth report. When the Sri Lankan government announced its decision to withdraw its co-sponsorship of Resolution 40/1 and the related Resolutions 34/1 and 30/1 in February 2020, it expressed its intention to pursue a process of inclusive accountability in terms of reconciliation, which would be implemented at national level. Now, the current report concludes that these national initiatives have not produced any results, further deepening impunity and exacerbating the mistrust of victims vis-à-vis the system. Sri Lanka, therefore, would still be denying the past. Switzerland is deeply concerned, given this impunity vis-à-vis serious violations of human rights which are alleged to have been committed more than 10 years ago. We'll call on the Sri Lankan government to accept and implement the recommendations from the Office of the High Commissioner and also the content of preceding resolutions regarding the human rights situation. In parallel, we encourage the Human Rights Council to take new measures to help victims and for justice in Sri Lanka. Madam High Commissioner, you're recommending that the Human Rights Council and Member States support a mechanism to collect and to preserve evidence and other related information for future accountability processes. Could you please explain how such a mechanism may be designed? Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Venezuela.
Thank you, President. In the resolution which gave rise to the support, the Office of the High Commissioner was asked to have consultations with the Sri Lankan government in order to strengthen technical assistance and advice given in protecting human rights. Sri Lanka has shown how serious it's been and its cooperation, its commitment to Council, as with its mechanisms, treaty bodies and the Office itself. In 2017, Sri Lanka successfully went through the UPR and there have been special procedures visiting. We regret the fact that Sri Lanka's progress hasn't really been taken into account when it comes to making real strides in human rights. They've also set up their 2017-2021 National Human Rights Programme. The Office of the High Commissioner welcomed the Sri Lankan commitment to implement the SDG agenda, adopting measures to consolidate peace. Venezuela rejects paragraph 59 of the report, which involves any interference with the Sri Lankan process. This Council has to support the efforts made by Sri Lanka and its people based on dialogue and cooperation, which are the mark of its work. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Japan for a video statement.
Japan notes the report of the High Commissioner and Sri Lanka's observations on it. Japan recognizes Sri Lanka's efforts to promote reconciliation and the well-being of all its people. including support to families of victims of enforced disappearance through the Office of Missing Persons and the Office for Reparations. Meanwhile, Japan notes reports of many uninvestigated disappearances and excessive restrictions on human rights in recent years. It is vital that Sri Lanka itself takes actions and introduces remedies to realize reconciliation and improvement of human rights. Japan sincerely hopes Sri Lanka will follow this path and expects the international community, including OHCHR, to support Sri Lanka's own initiatives. Japan has supported the reconciliation process through capacity building in the justice system. For many years, Japan's representative on peace building, rehabilitation and reconstruction, Mr. Akashi Yasushi, and Judge Noguchi Moto, has been dispatched to the country to work together with stakeholders. We will continue to encourage efforts by Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Netherlands for a video statement.
Madam President, the Kingdom of the Netherlands aligns itself with the EU statement. We thank the High Commissioner for her report on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. We strongly support the continuation of her mandate and encourage her to monitor progress in the implementation of the report's recommendations relating to reconciliation, accountability and human rights in Sri Lanka. Advancing accountability and international justice worldwide is one of the priorities of the human rights policy of the Kingdom of the Netherlands. We urge the Sri Lankan government to ensure an environment in which the Office on Missing Persons and Office for Reparations can operate effectively in order to ensure acknowledgement for victims and foster reconciliation in Sri Lanka. We welcome the recent remarks by President Rajapaksa that he will be a president for all Sri Lankans. We trust that his administration will follow up on the High Commissioner's recommendations by proactively encouraging a pluralist society, including a diverse civil society based on non-discrimination and protection of human rights for all, in line with its international human rights obligations and with a view to advancing the implementation of the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda. Madam High Commissioner, could you refer to examples of countries with a successful homegrown reconciliation process that could be of assistance to the government of Sri Lanka to strengthen its domestic reconciliation mechanisms? Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to India for a video statement.
Madam President, we have taken note of the High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka and her oral remarks. The Council has adopted 7 resolutions on the question of human rights in Sri Lanka since May 2009. India has been an active participant in the discussions and has remained engaged with Sri Lanka as its close friend and immediate neighbor. India's consistent position rests on 2 pillars: support for Sri Lanka's unity and territorial integrity, and abiding commitment to aspirations of the Tamils of Sri Lanka for equality, justice, peace and dignity. These are not either-or choices. We believe that respecting the rights of the Tamil community, including through meaningful devolution, contributes directly to the unity and integrity of Sri Lanka. Therefore, we advocate that delivering on the legitimate aspirations of the Tamil community is in the best interest of Sri Lanka. We call upon Sri Lanka to take necessary steps for addressing such aspirations, including through the process of reconciliation and full implementation of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution of Sri Lanka. The assessment of the High Commissioner raises important concerns. The Sri Lankan government has articulated its position on these issues as well. In evaluation of both of these, we should be guided by a commitment to find a lasting and effective solution for this issue. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you, and I give the floor to the Marshall Islands.
Thank you, Madam President. The Republic of the Marshall Islands thank the High Commissioner for a report and presentation. We join other nations in expressing serious concern regarding credible evidence of recent human rights violations in Sri Lanka. We regret that efforts towards a national process of accountability and reconciliation through various domestic commissions of inquiry have failed while the human rights situation has been deteriorating. We are also concerned about the shrinking civil society and media space and the numerous cases of extrajudicial killings. We We're also concerned about the accelerating militarization of civil government functions, especially the appointments of senior military officials who have been implicated in alleged war crimes and crimes against humanity during the final years of the conflict. The current human rights situation points towards a heightened risk of future violations, and taking preventive action is of utmost importance. In this regard, we support the recommendations of the High Commissioner to ensure an enhanced monitoring and regular reporting of the human rights situation in Sri Lanka. We are hopeful that going forward, better prevention is achieved to avoid further deterioration of the situation. Cont'd, and I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Democratic People's Republic of Korea.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly. Please proceed.
You can see me or?
We can see you and we can hear you. Please proceed. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam President. My delegation takes note of the High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka and has attentively listened to the statement made by the countries concerned. We note with appreciation the sincere efforts made by the government of Sri Lanka for promotion and protection of human rights in the country, despite many challenges. In our view, country report before the Council often debate from the principle of objectivity and non-bias, relying on unverified and groundless information spread by the media and dishonest forces for sinister political purposes, rather than the information provided by the concerned country. We are of the view that when dealing with the country's situation, the OHCHR should pay more attention to the explanation of the country's concern, as they know the real situation on the ground more than anyone else, and pursue sincere engagement in strict observance of the principle of impartiality, objectivity, non-politicization, non-interference, mutual respect, and cooperation. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Belgium for a video statement.
Madame la Présidente.
Madam President, Belgium aligns itself with the statement by the European Union, thanks to the High Commissioner for the report. We are gravely concerned at the undermining of the efforts by Sri Lanka in recent years towards accountability and human rights. The withdrawal of its support for the resolutions adopted by the Council by consensus can only be regretted. We call on Sri Lanka to address its past, seek the truth, and recognize the suffering that has occurred. Interference in investigations and judicial procedures pertaining to serious human rights violations and pressure on lawyers and investigators are unacceptable. Any investigation and reparation commission must be able to carry out its work effectively and in independence. We also call for an end to all forms of surveillance and intimidation of victims, human rights defenders, journalists, and civil society stakeholders who play an essential role in a democratic society. Madam High Commissioner, how can the independence and credibility of national accountability mechanisms be ensured? Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Gabon. Gabon, you have the floor.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam President. Gabon welcomes the efforts by the Office of the High Commissioner to ensure the promotion and protection of human rights throughout the world in the difficult context of the COVID pandemic. We note the report of the High Commissioner on the human rights situation in Sri Lanka, documenting violations of human rights that can undermine the progress made, particularly under Resolution 31 of the Human Rights Council, adopted on 1st of October 2015. on reconciliation, establishing responsibility and protection of human rights. My delegation also notes the efforts made by the authorities in Sri Lanka towards lasting inclusive peace and the country's readiness to continue cooperating with the Human Rights Council and its mechanism. In that connection, we call on the Office of the High Commissioner to continue dialogue and cooperation with the authorities of Sri Lanka to promote social cohesion and peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Pakistan.
Madam President. Am I audible, Madam President?
I can see you and I can hear you. Please proceed.
Thank you, Madam President. We take note of the High Commissioner's report presented pursuant to HRC Resolution 40/1. Pakistan has always advocated dialogue and cooperation as preferred means to promote and protect human rights. Accordingly, we call for continuation of consultations with the democratically elected Sri Lankan government on how best to advance the goals of accountability and reconciliation. For far too long, Sri Lanka has been a victim of terrorism, aided, abetted, and financed from abroad, including from its neighborhood. We commend Sri Lanka's strong democratic history and its impressive socio-economic achievements. Multi-ethnic composition of the parliament and the cabinet is also encouraging. The High Commissioner's report and this Council's deliberation should acknowledge these positive attributes. While appreciating the assurances by the Sri Lankan government to allow funeral rights to all religious minority amidst the ongoing COVID pandemic, we urge for early implementation of this commitment. The sacrifices and socio-economic progress made by Sri Lankan government needs to be appreciated. The Council's action should be aimed at enabling all its citizens to reach their full development potential, to live in peace and harmony, and enjoy as well as respect of all human rights. The best option remains a genuine dialogue and cooperation with Sri Lanka, including through technical cooperation, in accordance with the principles of impartiality and non-discrimination. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the United States of America.
Thank you, Madam President. We thank High Commissioner Bachelet for her comprehensive report and note the government of Sri Lanka's engagement. The United States shares OHCHR's concerns and urges Sri Lanka to make public a strategy and timetable for implementation of the report's recommendations. We are concerned by accounts of increasing marginalization of minority communities and shrinking space for civil society, including independent media. We remain concerned about the lack of accountability, including high-level appointments of military officials credibly accused of conflict-era abuses. The Sri Lankan government's efforts to address concerns raised in OHCHR's report via a domestic process need to be meaningful and credible. We note that the Sri Lankan's Commission of Inquiry does not include a mandate to pursue accountability, and that the Office of Missing Persons and Office of Reparations need to operate without political interference. We note that respect for the human rights of all Sri Lankans is critical to Sri Lanka's long-term peace, security, and prosperity, and call on the Sri Lankan government to take meaningful, concrete steps to promote accountability, justice, and reconciliation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Islamic Republic of Iran.
Thank you, Madam President. Iran appreciates Sri Lanka for its cooperation engagement with the UNHRC, showing determination of Sri Lanka to promote and protect human rights of its people. The UN human rights bodies and mechanisms should support governments upon their consent in implementing their obligations under applicable international human rights law. In this regard, OHCHR and the Council need to cooperate and support the states based on neutral, independent, and impartial approach in order to safeguard human rights from further politicization. The UN human rights bodies and mechanisms should refrain from speculation in addressing the human rights development of the states, the approach that only causes division and confrontation and reduces human rights into a tool for political agendas and undermines constructive engagement of states with the UN human rights bodies and mechanisms. Iran reiterates its principled position concerning the primary responsibility of states to promote and protect human rights and the importance of respecting their sovereignty, territorial integrity, and domestic jurisdiction. We fully recognize the tremendous challenge caused by the pandemic in Sri Lanka. The authorities are encouraged to continue their comprehensive approach to overcome the challenge and mitigate the consequences through meaningful engagement with all stakeholders and by according due respect to cultural and religious particularities of their respective constituencies. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Cameroon.
Thank you. We have always called for the principle of equal treatment and dialogue in inquiries carried out by experts and special rapporteurs. Sri Lanka's government, for example, the sound is poor, unfortunately. My delegation considers that the universality and objectivity and non-selectivity should have been upheld. The resolution and the situation falls under national competence. We call on the government to ensure a peaceful solution. The recommendation for targeted sanctions appears counterproductive because violence can only lead to violence, and we call on the international community to seek reconciliation. Our Council must remain within the framework of the Charter and uphold harmony and dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to China for a video statement.
Madam President, as a friendly neighbor of Sri Lanka, China sincerely hopes that Sri Lanka maintains political stability, ethnic solidarity, and national unity, and wishes Sri Lanka greater achievements in its national development. We commend the government of Sri Lanka for its efforts to actively promote and protect human rights, advance sustainable economic and social development, improve people's living standards, protect the rights of vulnerable groups, actively promote national reconciliation, and combat terrorism. It is the consistent stand of China to oppose politicization, double standards on human rights, as well as using human rights as pretext for interference in others' internal affairs. We are concerned about the prominent lack of impartiality shown in the OHCR's report on Sri Lanka and express our regret over the failure of OHCR to take on board the authoritative information provided by Sri Lankan government. The so-called preventive intervention and the proposed targeted sanctions contained in the report are clear interference in the internal affairs of Sri Lanka and oversteps the mandate of OHCHR. We hope the Council and OHCHR to strictly follow principles of impartiality, objectivity, non-selectivity, and non-politicization, respect the sovereignty and political independence of all countries, acknowledge the efforts of countries for protection and promotion of human rights, advocate constructive dialogue and cooperation, and abandon the practice of interfering in the internal affairs of state and exerting political pressure. Thank you, Madam President.
And I now give the floor to Belarus for a video statement.
Madam President, we confirm once more that Belarus does not support the adoption of country resolutions without the agreement of the affected country's government. Country initiatives are not long-term effective resolutions. Resolution 40/1, in keeping with which the report is provided, is no different from a country resolution, and it is noteworthy that Sri Lanka withdrew its co-sponsorship from the resolution. We have looked carefully at the report of the OHCHR and note that it is one-sided and not impartial. It is disappointing that the report does not take into account information provided by the government of Sri Lanka. OHCHR notes that from August 2019, there were no visits by the Special Procedures to Sri Lanka, but we believe it will come as no surprise to the Office of the High Commissioner if we point out that a large number of the co-sponsors of Resolution 40/1 did not receive visits from the Special Rapporteurs for 5 or even 20 years. For example, the Czech Republic has not had visits from 1999, Finland and Malta from 2015, and Luxembourg has never had any. Sri Lanka, however, in the last 4 years has had visits from 10 mandate holders, which is a sort of a record. We call on the Human Rights Council to continue mutually respectful dialogue with Sri Lanka without politically motivated solutions. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Maldives.
Thank you, Madam President. The Maldives has always been supportive of Sri Lanka's efforts and progress in overcoming the challenges it faces related to human rights and democracy. Sri Lanka is a close neighbor and an important development partner of Maldives. As one of the oldest democracies in South Asia, we believe that the country is well positioned to find solutions within its established democratic processes. We are confident that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, the Human Rights Council and its mechanisms, and the government of Sri Lanka will closely cooperate in a comprehensive manner that would protect the rights of Sri Lankan people. We also appreciate the continued commitment of the international community to assist Sri Lanka to pursue its human rights agenda. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Montenegro for a video statement.
Madam President, Montenegro welcomes the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of Sri Lanka and its assessments of the implementation of the Human Rights Council resolution and other relevant processes relating to reconciliation, accountability, and human rights in Sri Lanka. We recognize and welcome the government's public commitment to the 2030 agenda and some developments towards peace building, reparation, and restitution. But to build sustainable peace and development and an inclusive, diverse, and pluralistic society based on non-discrimination and protection of human rights for all, it is crucial that the Sri Lankan authorities effectively address the harmful legacies of war, strengthen democratic and independent institutions, and end impunity, while we duly respect the government's decision to set and internally conduct process to advance reconciliation, accountability, and human rights. We consider it crucial to establish a comprehensive accountability process for all human rights violations and abuses committed in Sri Lanka and to provide redress to victims. We believe this is the right way to confront the past and to pursue a meaningful path towards the promotion and protection of human rights, truth, justice, reconciliation, and accountability in the country. To that end, Montenegro recalls the importance of the government's continued commitment to cooperate and to positively engage with the United Nations and its agencies, notably with the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, as well as the Human Rights Council and other human rights mechanisms and mandates. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Vietnam.
Madam President, Vietnam thanks the Office of the High Commissioner for the report on Sri Lanka. Vietnam acknowledges Sri Lanka's valiant effort to reassert democratic norms and preserve order and stability in the countries. Besides, we welcome the continued commitment by the government of Sri Lanka to remain engaged with and seek the assistance of the United Nations and its agencies, including human rights mandates and mechanisms, in capacity building and technical assistance. Madam President, Sri Lanka has outlined a clear plan of the 43rd sessions of the
We seem to have lost Vietnam. We are trying to get Vietnam back. If we could, let's be patient. Could the distinguished representative of Vietnam start again, please?
Restart my statement.
Please, if you could. If you could start your statement again, we will start the timer again. Thank you.
I will start my statement. Madam President, Vietnam thanks the Office of the High Commissioner for the report on Sri Lanka. Vietnam acknowledges Sri Lanka's valiant effort to reassert democratic norms and preserve order and stability in the country. Besides, we welcome the continued commitment by the government of Sri Lanka to remain engaged with and seek the assistance of the United Nations and its agencies, including human rights mandates and mechanisms, in capacity building and technical assistance. Madam President, Sri Lanka has outlined a clear plan of the 43rd sessions of the Human Rights Council to achieve sustainable peace through an inclusive, domestically designed and executed reconciliation and accountability process, and Sri Lanka has already commenced the implementation of this difficult process. We hope that Sri Lanka, the Human Rights Council, and the international community will continue to engage in constructive dialogue and cooperation to advance human rights in Sri Lanka, guided by the Council's fundamental principles of universality, impartiality, objectivity, and non-selectivity. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I give the floor to the Syrian Arab Republic.
Yeah, do you hear me now?
I give the floor to Syria.
Hear me?
I can hear you. We just can't see you immediately. If you just bear with us.
Yeah, is it fine now?
Yes, we can see you and we can hear you. Please proceed.
Okay, thank you, Madam President.
The Syrian Arab Republic stresses the importance of international cooperation based on the non-interference in the internal affairs of states and respecting the provisions of the UN Charter as the cornerstone in the promotion and the protection of human rights. Syria renews its objection to double standards and politicization in the work of the Council, and it emphasizes the respect for the principles of inclusivity, objectivity, and non-selectivity in dealing with human rights issues. In this context, Syria calls for dialogue with the legitimate government of Sri Lanka to address the issues in accordance with an approach that respects its constitutional and legal system and acknowledges its national responsibilities to protect its citizens and achieve sustainable peace in the country. Syria welcomes Sri Lanka's commitment to the promotion and protection of human rights and to continue the cooperation with the Council and its mechanisms. Syria stresses the need for the reports submitted within the framework of the Council to be based on substantiated and credible information, far from speculations and assumptions. In conclusion, Syria warns of politicizing the approaches based on prevention and emerging trends in the work of the Council, which would deepen the tensions and polarization within it. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And we now give the floor to Malawi. Malawi, you have the floor. We will return to Malawi. I now give the floor to Cambodia for a video statement.
Madam President, my delegation takes notes of relevant reports as to the situation in Sri Lanka and welcomes the country's constructive cooperation with the UNHRC and active engagements with various mandate holders. The government's commitment to the 2030 agenda, including an appointment of the new Sustainable Development Council, as well as positive steps taken to continue peace building and to mitigate the spread of the COVID-19, should be recognized. Cambodia also notes that the challenges confronting Sri Lanka are complex in nature. As the international community, we can keep our role within a constructive framework respecting Sri Lanka-led and Sri Lankan-owned process based on national priorities and institutions. Madam President, human rights agenda must be discussed through a genuine dialogue-based approach with non-confrontation, non-politicization and non-selectivity, based on verified source of information, bearing in mind the national particularity of each country. The enduring strength of all human rights mechanisms lies in an even-handed approach with transparency, objectivity, and impartiality, as well as in full adherence to the principle of sovereign equality, territorial integrity, and non-interference, which are well enshrined in the UN Charter. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Nepal for a video statement.
Madam President, Madam High Commissioner, we thank the High Commissioner for the presentation of the report. We take note of the engagement of UNHRC and other human rights mechanisms with the government of Sri Lanka, including in the preparation of the report. we value the work and contribution of the UN human rights system towards the universal respect of human rights. We believe that reports by human rights bodies should avoid unverified information, including news reports or comments gathered from ongoing discussions and consultations. Comments of the country concerned should be given a proper place. Madam President, Nepal's own experience tells us that when conflict transformation and peace process is homegrown, nationally led and owned, as well as based on the ground reality, the chances of its success remain high. We view that in the context of promoting reconciliation, accountability, human rights and lasting peace in Sri Lanka, these aspects need to be given due consideration. We wish every success to Sri Lanka for its efforts to achieve sustainable peace and reconciliation in the country, while respecting universally recognized human rights. I thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Egypt for a video statement.
Madam President, our delegation takes note of the report of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights on Sri Lanka, and we stress the importance of abiding by the principles of universality, objectivity, and keeping away from selectivity and double standards and interference in the internal affairs of the countries, while according attention to the building of national institutions and technical cooperation. We also stress on the importance of the Council and the UNHRC office continuing and fostering dialogue and coordination with the state concerned when dealing with any decisions related to that state, in order to achieve a positive outcome and to provide the necessary assistance in accordance with national priorities. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Ireland for a video statement.
Ireland aligns with the statement of the EU. Ireland welcomes the High Commissioner's report, and we share her concern regarding worrying human rights trends in Sri Lanka, including a shrinking democratic space, the surveillance and obstruction of civil society, and the militarization of civilian government functions. Less than 2 years ago, there was a global outpouring of support and sympathy for Sri Lanka in the aftermath of the Easter Sunday attacks. We deeply regret that the High Commissioner's recent findings do not identify a renewed spirit of reconciliation and accountability in response to these terrible attacks. But on the contrary, it finds that minorities are being increasingly marginalized and excluded, including in statements by Sri Lanka's leadership and their national vision and government policy. We have noted the responses of the Sri Lankan authorities to this report. We urge the authorities to re-engage and cooperate fully with this Council and the OHCHR in the interests of protecting the human rights of all in Sri Lanka. We also call on Sri Lanka to promptly and thoroughly investigate all allegations of human rights violations and abuses, ensure those responsible are prosecuted, and provide adequate remedy to victims. High Commissioner, what priority actions should be taken to support a safe and enabling environment for civil society in Sri Lanka? Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Azerbaijan.
Madam President, Azerbaijan takes note of the report submitted by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and information provided by Sri Lanka as a concerned state. We would like to emphasize that all matters falling within the domestic jurisdiction of UN member states, including that of Sri Lanka, must be resolved through dialogue and cooperation based on respect for the rule of law, independence, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and inviolability of international borders of states. We believe that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights should favor constructive dialogue and cooperation with the government of Sri Lanka and provide it with necessary advisory services, technical and financial assistance upon its request to support government's actions and programs in ensuring human rights in Sri Lanka. In conclusion, Azerbaijan strongly condemns all the manifestations of terrorism, extremism, and aggressive separatism throughout the world. I thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Lao People's Democratic Republic.
Thank you, Madam President. The Lao delegation wishes to thank the High Commissioner for her report on human rights situation in Sri Lanka. The Lao takes note of the progress made by Sri Lanka on the reconciliation and human rights in the country, which creates more conducive conditions for its socio-economic development. Madam President, the Lao, like other UN member states, supports the constructive engagement and cooperation between the states and the OHCHR to address human rights issues in a fair, objective, non-politicized, and non-selective manner. We also wish to emphasize that the OHCHR and the human rights mechanisms should respect the information provided by states and also assist the government in addressing human rights issues on the ground, as it has primary responsibility for the promotion and protection of all human rights in the country. I thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Nicaragua.
Gracias, señora presidenta.
Thank you, Madam President. The Republic of Nicaragua recognizes the readiness and constructive commitment of the government of Sri Lanka to the international community and the United Nations mechanisms. We welcome the information from Sri Lanka, which shows its commitment to the treaty bodies and special procedures on human rights, and call on states members to take note of this. We also commend the actions by Sri Lanka to develop a plan that achieves sustainable peace through a process of reconciliation and accountability, an inclusive process. We regret that the report does not reflect comments made by the government of Sri Lanka. The Council must ensure that country reports are not used as a method to justify criminal actions against the peace of our nations. President, it is important that the reports presented here encourage international constructive cooperation and respect among nations instead of provoking divisions which do not guarantee support to our peoples to establish solid, lasting peace. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Cuba.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, President. The Human Rights Council should focus on cooperation and constructive dialogue through universal mechanisms such as the UPR as the sole guarantee for a fair, non-selective approach to human rights issues. The resolution that gave rise to this dialogue does not have the support of the concerned country. Thus, any action or mandate from it will only contribute to politicization, selectivity, and double standards. Cooperation, dialogue, and respectful exchanges among countries based on the United Nations Charter are the road to promotion and protection of human rights. Cuba will continue to defend that principle. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Eritrea.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Eritrea takes note of the report of the High Commissioner and have the following comments on the report and methodology. It is an established international principle that promotion of human rights is seen in relation to the intrinsic obligation attached to the ideals of humanity in which all nations share collective responsibility. In this vein, Eritrea has always advocated for the dialogue and cooperation as the best solution and way forward. Like any other country, Sri Lanka faces challenges and problems in all areas of developmental sectors, including in the human rights domain. Despite challenges, however, Sri Lanka has demonstrated responsibility to promote and protect human rights in accordance to the context, needs, and human betterment ideals of Sri Lankan society. In this regard, dignified engagement and cooperation predicted in mutual respect and understanding based on national priorities can deliver best. On its part, Sri Lanka has been engaged in cooperation through the UPR and also by co-sponsoring the current resolution 40/1 to address its challenges. However, accountability can be best served by encouraging and building national institutions in Sri Lanka. Madam President, Eritrea, as of its own experience, that targeting any country through establishing a mandate without the consent of the concerned state is counterproductive, both for the subjects and the state. The UPR and other positive manageable institutions can serve the best of the interests for service of the state. So thank you so much, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now return the floor to Malawi. Malawi, you have the floor.
Malawi, you can speak.
I understand that Malawi is not available. We will now turn to the list of speakers for national human rights institutions and non-governmental organizations. And I give the floor to the International Movement Against All Forms of Discrimination and Racism. You have the floor.
Madam President, we welcome the High Commissioner's report on Sri Lanka. Human rights in Sri Lanka are not threatened by the centralization of executive powers and weakening of the independence of the judiciary and key commissions, including the Human Rights Commission and the Office of Missing Persons. With a rubber-stamping Parliamentary Council, President Rajapaksa has absolute powers to appoint members of these institutions. This Council must stay alert to appointments of OMP commissioners once the current members finish their mandate this week. The report of the Presidential Commission of Inquiry on Political Victimization threatens the democratic fabric of the country, which includes recommendations to take legal actions against those pursuing human rights investigations. This is a direct threat to human rights defenders, victims, and witnesses. It heightens fear of reprisal and brings back memory of the past. Although the recent government's indication to allow burials of COVID-19 victims is a positive step, the Council must remain concerned by the continuing discriminated treatment of Tamil and Muslim minorities, such as the after use of Prevention of Terrorism Act, increased surveillance, and the demolition of the memorial monument in the Jaffna University, to name a few. While we have continuously called for an international accountability mechanism on Sri Lanka, we support the High Commissioner's recommendations and urge the Human Rights Council to give monitoring and evidence-gathering mandates to the UHRC. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Amnesty International.
Madam President, Amnesty International welcomes the important OHHR report on Sri Lanka, which provides a stark assessment and makes clear recommendations for preventive action by this Council. We share deep concern over clear early warning signs of a deteriorating human rights situation and a significantly heightened risk of future violations. Last week, we released a report detailing the significant crackdown on civil society and freedom of expression and the resulting climate of fear, and share concerns over increased repression and marginalization of minorities. The report before us today, as well as a recent assessment by Special Procedures, reinforces our own assessment that domestic accountability measures cannot be considered credible, given the repeated past failure of such processes, recent backsliding on important emblematic cases, changes to the Constitution that seriously erode the independence of domestic justice processes and the National Human Rights Commission, and the real fear of reprisals against victims and witnesses. The Council must redouble its efforts to help end the cycle of impunity which continues to fuel violations and to deny victims and their families rights to truth, justice and reparation. It is critical that the UN learn from past failures, including in Sri Lanka, and ensure the clear early warning signals highlighted by the High Commissioner are responded to with the concrete preventive actions recommended, specifically to mandate enhanced monitoring and reporting on the situation and the collection and preservation of evidence for future prosecutions. Madam High Commissioner, perhaps you could elaborate further on why that is so important, not only for the past, but also for the future of the country. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Madam President. It is 11 years since tens of thousands of civilians were killed in the final months of Sri Lanka's civil war. Both parties committed war crimes for which no one has been held to account. For nearly a decade, the Council has engaged Sri Lanka, seeking to support a national process of accountability and reconciliation through consensus resolutions. Last year, soon after Gotabaya Rajapaksa was elected president, the government renounced those commitments. Just this week, the Foreign Minister addressed the Council, denying international crimes, rejecting the Council's resolutions, and dismissing the High Commission's report as propaganda. No one can seriously believe the government has any intention of pursuing justice. The government has appointed those implicated in war crimes to positions of authority, pardoned one of the few soldiers ever convicted for the massacre of civilians, and denied intimidation of activists engaging with this council. It has adopted discriminatory policies, including the cruel and unjustified forcible cremation of Muslims who die with COVID-19. The High Commissioner rightly characterized Sri Lanka as being in a state of denial, unable and unwilling to address its past, with direct impact on its present and future. Now, activists, victims' families, even those Sri Lankan officials who have sought justice, are at risk. Lawyers have been arbitrarily detained. Protesters calling for council action have been summoned by the police. The Council should give effect to the High Commissioner's recommendations to advance accountability and prevent further abuses. The international community has failed the people of Sri Lanka in the past. It must not do so again.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development.
Madam President, Forum Asia welcomes the High Commissioner's report and echoes her concerns on the situation in Sri Lanka. Systematic surveillance and harassment of human rights defenders, civil society, journalists, victims and their families have escalated in the past year. Continued detention of human rights lawyer Hijaz Hizbullah since April 2020, reportedly under the Prevention of Terrorism Act, is emblematic of threats against human rights defenders in Sri Lanka. Such threats and fears of reprisals have led to increasing self-censorship and prevented active participation of defenders and victims in this session of the Council. Forced cremation of COVID-19 deceased, contrary to the beliefs of the Muslims and other minorities as well as WHO guidelines, and obstruction of memorialization of victims of the conflict by the Tamil community are some of the recent examples of the growing majoritarian policies that have led to resurgence of violence and discrimination against ethnic and religious minorities. The 20th Amendment to the Constitution, which undermines the independence of the judiciary and democratic institutions and removes institutional checks and balances, has accelerated Sri Lanka's descent towards authoritarianism. The government has actively obstructed investigations into past violations and demonstrated it has no intention of pursuing accountability. The Council should not be misled by the appointment of yet another commission of inquiry. Any hope of justice for thousands of victims and survivors and preventing further deterioration in Sri Lanka lies in the Council's principled action based on the High Commissioner's recommendations. Thank you.
Thank you. And I give the floor to Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada.
Madam President, Lawyers' Rights Watch Canada thanks the High Commissioner for her report. We share the concern that the prevalence of impunity in Sri Lanka warrants the Council's immediate attention. The lack of accountability and deliberate failures to implement recommendations by this Council to address past violations against Tamil people, including extrajudicial killings, enforced disappearances, arbitrary detention, torture, and sexual violence, increases the likelihood of their reoccurrence. We are disturbed by the systemic pattern of surveillance, harassment, and intimidation of human rights defenders, lawyers, and victims of human rights violations and their families in an attempt to silence these voices. The government's suppression of memorialization of victims of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, the crackdown on protests, and the forced cremation of Muslim and other religious minorities in a militarized COVID-19 framework are deeply alarming trends. These warning signs are evident that Sri Lanka is on the wrong path, and any domestic mechanism for justice and accountability will fail. International intervention is urgently required to prevent a further decay of human rights. We call upon the Council to strengthen its monitoring in Sri Lanka and set out a coherent, effective, and time-bound plan to advance accountability options at the international level. Take the necessary steps to refer the situation in Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court, and urge member states to utilize the principle of universal jurisdiction to actively pursue within their national courts the prosecution of international crimes committed in Sri Lanka and impose sanctions such as travel bans and freezing assets of known perpetrators of grave human rights violations in Sri Lanka. Thank you, Madam President.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the International Commission of Jurists.
Madam President, the ICJ welcomes the comprehensive OHCHR report on Sri Lanka. We share the Office's observation that domestic initiatives for accountability have repeatedly failed to produce results, more deeply entrenching impunity and exacerbated victims' distrust in the system. The ICJ has continuously observed that Sri Lanka's incapacity and unwillingness to pursue accountability for crimes under international law is deep-rooted and long-standing. The extensive militarization of civilian functions, the reversal of constitutional safeguards, the obstruction of the rare cases of domestic criminal accountability, and the deteriorating human rights situation all point to a systemic culture of impunity that will only worsen in the years to come. Sri Lanka's failure to establish a hybrid accountability mechanism in the 5 years since the adoption of Resolution 30/1 demonstrates a complete lack of political will to hold perpetrators accountable. The rights of victims of human rights violation cannot be ignored any longer. The ICJ endorses all of the Office recommendations, particularly the call for international and external accountability mechanisms, whether before the ICC or through the exercise of universal jurisdiction by states. We further call for enhanced monitoring and reporting on ground situations and for the establishment of a mechanism for collection and preservation of evidence for future prosecutions. Madam High Commissioner, how can the Office ensure that the victims' call for accountability is effectively fulfilled? Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative.
The Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative shares the concerns on the disquieting human rights situation in Sri Lanka raised in the High Commissioner's report, the joint assessment by the special procedures and other civil society groups. Over the last year, we have witnessed a major rollback on international obligations as well as meaningful efforts towards accountability and reconciliation by Sri Lanka, most visibly by its unilateral withdrawal from Resolution 30/1. The national measures and the ad hoc commission of inquiry to review the findings of previous commissions appear to have undone the limited steps taken towards transitional justice. Successive domestic processes have failed the victims and their families for years, denoting both the inability and unwillingness of the government to address past violations and impunity. This lack of acknowledgement of past crimes, increased militarization, dilution of constitutional safeguards, reprisals against civil society, and exclusionary discourse against ethno-religious minorities are indicative of a significant risk of further violations. We underline the preventive role of the Council in this context as highlighted in the High Commissioner's report and as has been discussed since 2009. The Council must remain prepared to prevent recurrence of future violations. We urge the Council to pass a robust resolution on Sri Lanka, outlining the necessary international action including strengthened monitoring by the UNHRC, creation of an international independent investigative mechanism to collect and preserve evidence of past and ongoing human rights violations, pursuit of alternative accountability avenues, and such other collective action manifesting the Council's principled commitment to secure justice for victims, survivors and their families. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Civicus, World Alliance for Citizen Participation.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the report of the High Commissioner, which concludes that domestic initiatives for accountability have repeatedly failed to produce results. Reneging on its international commitments has put any prospect of justice, truth and reparations in Sri Lanka at grave risk. This has been compounded by an escalation of attacks against civil society over the last months, particularly against groups and people working to further human rights. As civic space has been squeezed tighter under the Rajapaksa administration, human rights lawyers, activists and academics have been targeted with arrests, intimidation or threats for speaking up. Independent NGOs are increasingly being silenced as the administration has sought to restrict them. With NGOs who document, monitor and report on past and current rights violations raided and attacked, it is abundantly clear that much publicized national accountability processes are as such in name only. The Human Rights Council once again has the opportunity not only to secure justice and accountability for past crimes, but to protect those on the ground who are being subjected to human rights violations now, and those at risk, a risk increased by ongoing impunity of further violations in the future. Warnings of a deteriorating human rights situation have been given by human rights defenders, by journalists, by special rapporteurs and by the High Commissioner. The Council must take action to ensure heightened scrutiny on Sri Lanka, including adopting a resolution mandating enhanced monitoring and other necessary steps towards furthering accountability. We thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to the Society for Threatened Peoples.
Thank you, Madam President. We welcome the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and echo the High Commissioner's warning that Sri Lanka is on an alarming path towards recurrence of grave human rights violations. We have to remember why the Democratic Socialist Republic of Sri Lanka is on the agenda today. 12 years ago, tens of thousands of Tamils were killed, predominantly by government shelling. Virtually all massacres against Tamils by Sri Lankan security forces remain unpunished, while some of the alleged perpetrators are leading the Sri Lankan state. The government of Sri Lanka has repeatedly demonstrated its utter lack of political will to serve justice for atrocity crimes against Tamils, who make up the largest group of victims from the conflict and who continue to be affected by ongoing human rights violations. Tamils have consistently rejected any form of domestic justice mechanism. In line with the High Commissioner's report, we urge Member States to make use of the number of options to advance accountability and justice, including referring Sri Lanka to the International Criminal Court, as well as practicing extraterritorial and universal jurisdiction. Member States must ensure that any evidence-gathering mechanism established has a clearly mandated purpose of aiming to prepare case dossiers for international prosecution of the most serious international crimes and human rights violations. Decisive international interventions on mass atrocities committed by Sri Lanka's security forces are necessary to protect and promote international human rights and humanitarian law. Tamil lives depend on it too. Thank you.
Thank you. And I now give the floor to Christian Solidarity Worldwide.
Thank you, Madam President. CSW thanks the High Commissioner for her report on Sri Lanka. We regret the current government's actions which undermine human rights through the militarization of civilian government functions, the reversal of constitutional safeguards, the obstruction of accountability, and the shrinking space for civil society. We urge the international community to continue its scrutiny of Sri Lanka through the renewal of the resolution with regular reporting to the Human Rights Council and by enhancing investigative and monitoring mechanisms with a view to greater accountability. As the High Commissioner's report outlines, increasing ethno-nationalist sentiments have led to an increase in hate speech and discriminatory practices which threaten national security, peace-building efforts, and respect among religion or belief groups. Social media in Sri Lanka continues to play a major role in the spread of stereotypes, misconceptions of religious minorities, and hate speech with impunity, including throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. We welcome the High Commissioner's attention to the impact of COVID-19 on the right to freedom of religion or belief. Forced cremations of COVID-19 victims have prevented Muslims from conducting their own practices in violation of burial rights, despite the World Health Organization's guidelines stating that victims of COVID-19 can be buried or cremated. CSW urges Sri Lanka to take concrete measures aimed at preventing hate speech online and offline, investigating and prosecuting those who incite violence against ethnic and religious minorities. We further urge Sri Lanka to ensure that restrictions on the manifestation of freedom of religion or belief during COVID-19 are proportional and non-discriminatory. Thank you.
Thank you. And that was the last speaker that we could accommodate for this dialogue. I will now give the floor to the Deputy High Commissioner for her concluding remarks. The floor is yours.
Dear colleagues, excellencies, for all the contributions. Let me start with a question of procedure, just to say that we enjoy a very open, frank and constructive relationship with the government of Sri Lanka. We received comments from the government that were carefully studied for any factual details that were then incorporated where the changes were necessary. The formal submission of the report, in fact, was delayed by 3 weeks to accommodate the requests of the government, and since then, in fact, the government's comments and the letter from the permanent delegation have been posted on the website of the Council, and they are fully available for your own perusal. Let me then move to a question. I think there was a concern expressed by the Philippines on the report's failure to acknowledge the challenges related to the pandemic. Let me say, on the contrary, the report fully acknowledges the unprecedented challenges that Sri Lanka has had to face in this regard of COVID-19, but the militarization of the civilian functions highlighted is not really exclusive to COVID-19. In fact, it includes an expansion of the functions of the Ministry of Defense and the Ministry of Public Security in a whole host of areas, of walks of life, the appointment of military personnel to multiple task forces dealing with issues as diverse as poverty reduction and archaeological heritage. And this is, I think, the point that we wish to make. Moving on, I will take the questions as much as I can in order. Let me say, to the question of the EU involving and protecting victims and ensuring accountability. In a country like Sri Lanka, where there are thousands of victims, they must, of course, have a central place in the design and implementation of any accountability mechanism. The national consultation processes that accompanied Resolution 30/1 in Sri Lanka recommended such a victim-centered approach, but we have seen that victims have been ignored and left out. And we are able and have provided technical support and assistance to the government on designing and implementing victim-sensitive procedures in order to make sure that we are guaranteeing victims' safety and dignity, making sure that providing evidence is safe, gender-sensitive and straightforward as possible. And I think this issue, the protection of the victims and their informed consent, is really at the core of the matter. Germany referred to their case against a member of the LTTE and asked what we can help. Obviously, we seek to cooperate with national judicial processes that seek accountability in these cases of serious human rights violations. When we get these requests, we will identify materials in our possession which can be disclosed. Obviously, we sometimes have to redact them to protect the UN interests in documentation. This is obviously a time-sensitive issue, and it's a procedure that is tested. We have over the years accumulated an extensive documentation of serious violations committed in Sri Lanka, and a dedicated capacity would enable us to focus the resources to engage with and respond to such requests with greater speed, efficiency and effectiveness, also providing guidance to victims and civil society in their own efforts to invoke and use these principles. France asked what if there is not continued engagement with the government. We sincerely hope that Sri Lanka will remain engaged with the Council. I think we are all on the same side here, long-term peace, and that is why this Council has invested so much effort and time into providing the pathway that was laid down in Resolution 30/1. We are encouraged that the government has signaled its commitment here to continue this engagement, and many of you have spoken to that. But not only the government, there are many other stakeholders in Sri Lanka, in particular civil society, which is also engaged. And let me mention the other tracks. So again, there was mention today of the UPR, but the special procedures, the treaty bodies, these are all complementary, not mutually exclusive avenues, and we know that they converge in the end towards these outcomes. The issue of the independence and credibility of national accountability mechanisms, I think it was Belgium. Obviously, building and maintaining the trust of victims and their relatives is essential to any national accountability mechanism. We are concerned that harassment, surveillance and scrutiny by security agencies of families, lawyers and others have undermined the work of institutions like the Office of Missing Persons. Domestic processes continue to be unable to deliver any meaningful resolutions, and this has eroded the principle and the practice of justice, of course. And I think this is why we are now calling for a broader accountability. The Netherlands asked about successful homegrown reconciliation processes. We have offered a lot of assistance to Sri Lanka, and other member states have also offered to share experiences. We have, for example, the Sri Lankan delegation facilitated travel to South Africa to explore lessons learned. I think that's a key one. I think the challenge is that these examples rely on other factors, particularly the political will. I mean, in the end, they have to be custom-made, of course, and nationally owned. And this credibility, in fact, is measured by the trust that is received from victims and other stakeholders. I think we have, one second, I think Switzerland, how will a future mechanism be conceived and set up? There are several models for a mechanism that is, as the report raises. There are the fully independent mechanisms, for example, that have been established in the case of Syria or Myanmar. There is the internal accountability project on DPRK or a new configuration. I think this is entirely up to the Council to see what is the best fit for the discharge of specific accountability functions. I think most important is that the specialized resources needed to analyze the material and the technological capabilities to store and process large volumes of information are very important. Homegrown. For Canada, how to most effectively support the gathering and preserving of evidence. I think this follows on from my last answer. The High Commissioner is asking the Council and the Member States to support a dedicated capacity in this regard. As I said, it could be an independent mechanism or just a dedicated capacity within OHCHR. Let me emphasize again, there is a huge amount of material documentation and evidence accumulated over the years, and it's important that this is brought together, securely preserved in one place where it can really be made available to support future accountability processes and judicial proceedings, including in member states with the competent jurisdiction. It's a significant and complex task, and we would need the appropriate resources and expertise to work on it. I think there was a question from Ireland, priority actions to support the safe and enabling environment for civil society. The High Commissioner clearly recommends that the government orders all security agencies to immediately end all forms of surveillance and harassment, including reprisals against human rights defenders, social actors and victims. I think this has been, and we've heard some of the NGO voices, this has really had a chilling effect on civic and democratic space. Certain laws have been misused, and I think the government, it seems, is also planning to review the act that regulates the operations of NGOs. I think any legislative reforms must comply with international legal obligations. This is a point made by the High Commissioner, and we must continue to work towards this enabling environment for civil society. And I hope that the diplomatic community will be ready to raise cases where human rights defenders under threat or reprisal should be raised, increasing resources for those civil society organizations. A couple of last comments, I think, from civil society participants, how we should contribute to accountability and why that's so important. I think the report is clear that there is a strong link between the past, present and future in Sri Lanka. The failure to address the past, as we have mentioned on numerous occasions, which would involve ending impunity and ensuring an overhaul of the security apparatus, the laws and the policies have all been put to the wayside. It is essential, therefore, that the Council remains alert and uses the full range of the toolbox that we put on offer to prevent any further escalation. Strengthening the capacity of this office to monitor human rights violations is also essential in this regard. For all these reasons, ladies and gentlemen, and I hope I did justice to the questions, but clearly we commend the report once again to your attention and believe that we can work together to explore all avenues to advance reconciliation, accountability and human rights for Sri Lanka. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank you. This brings us to the end of this interactive dialogue. I wish to thank the High Commissioner and the Deputy High Commissioner for their participation. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen,